Well, let's get started. Hello, everyone. I'm Vince Jackson, Executive Director of the Greater Northampton Chamber of Commerce. I want to welcome you to another session of our Link and Learn educational series sponsored by Florence Bank. Thank you, Florence Bank, for continuing to sponsor these programs that educate our community and keep us all informed. We appreciate Florence Bank's continued support. Today, we have an exciting program for you, and I am incredibly proud of the panel of experts that we have assembled here this afternoon. They are amazing leaders who will share some interesting stories about how their organizations have made strides on the diversity front, particularly when it comes to diversifying their boards. Hence, the title of today's session is Diversity in Leadership. And today's session will be moderated by Deborah Cohen, who is the founder and a leading expert in the Pioneer Valley on diversity. And Human in Common, Deborah's organization, is a group of, and I'm going to use my quotes here, ethical upstander trainers who provide tools, models of excellence, best practices, training programs, approaches, templates, everything that you need in your arsenal of tools that will help you advance your own personal goals for diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, as well as those of your organization. And Deborah, I want to publicly thank you for being a great resource to the Chamber of Commerce, Northampton Chamber of Commerce, and others, and also for being a personal ally to me. I appreciate so much your consistent outreach, especially during those times when we as a country feel like our shared vision for racial equity has taken a deep dive. And unfortunately, we have those emotions much too often. But I just appreciate so much your outreach and support of me. So thank you, Deborah. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Deborah, to kick it off because we have much to get into. So let's get started.
Well, thank you, Vince, for that warm introduction. I really appreciate it. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this important conversation. I have to just thank my friends at the Greater Northampton Chamber of Commerce. I appreciate your kind words, Vince, and I think I speak for the entire Human in Common team when I say that we truly appreciate, enjoy, and thrive from our collaboration with you and your amazing team at the Chamber. We began our journey together a few years ago. Vince had just taken the helm as the executive director of the Chamber, and my co-founder, Nialina Ali, and I had just spent 2 years researching and developing our trainings, and we were ready to launch. And so Vince, when we met with you and Jess Thompson, who's the Director of Community and Investor Relations at the Chamber, kind of the goddess of all wonderful things at the Chamber, we met to brainstorm about how we could make diversity, equity, inclusion in general, and racial equity in particular, a priority in the local community. And that's just led to an exciting partnership of hosting trainings and focusing on interrupting racism. We also did some interrupting sexual harassment and assault training, I think a year ago. And it's just been a wonderful partnership. So I appreciate you inviting us here for this important discussion. So with us today, I'm happy to introduce our wonderful panel. As Vince said, we have a wonderful team joining us today. So we have John Bidwell, who's the Executive Director of the United Way of Hampshire County. John's background is in strategic planning, marketing, and branding, most notably with nonprofits. He is the co-author of Shores Beyond Shores, From Holocaust to Hope. John served in the Peace Corps in Mali and holds a BA from McGill University, and we're so grateful to John for being here. John is also, and his team at the United Way, they're very generously supporting our series of Interrupting Racism trainings this spring so that small businesses and nonprofits can attend at no cost. So we're grateful to have John and the United Way support, and happy to have you here with us today. Jeff Harness is also on our panel today. He is the Chief Community Relations and Communications Officer at Cooley Dickinson Hospital. Jeff has an extensive background in public health in the region and serves as the executive sponsor for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then also we recruited to our panel, a little reluctantly at first, but then with enthusiasm, Vince Jackson, who, as everyone knows, is the executive director of the Greater Northampton Chamber of Commerce. And he's also I believe, executive director of the Hampshire County Regional Tourism Council. Is that right, Vince?
That's right.
Okay, and for 19 years prior to his current position at the Chamber, Vince was the founder, president, and CEO of Marketing Moves Incorporated, a Dallas-based consultancy specializing in brand strategy, product innovation, and marketing communications. His clients have included Frito-Lay, Interstate Batteries, Johnson & Johnson, and prior to having his own company, Vince had a successful corporate career at PepsiCo, Kraft, Procter & Gamble. So we're always grateful for the wealth of knowledge and skill and experience that Vince is so generously willing to share with all of us who are members of the Chamber of Commerce who come to him for advice and suggestions. And then also with us on our panel today is my colleague and friend, Kevin McCarthy, who is actually a member of Human in Common. He's a licensed social worker, licensed clinical social worker, I should say, specializing in assisting people with co-occurring mental health and substance use disorders. He's the clinical coordinator for substance addiction services at Elliott Community Human Services and serves on the board of Massachusetts Organization for Addiction Recovery as the president of the board. He considers himself a social worker for social justice and a DEI change maker in the human services industry. So I'm thrilled to be here with Kevin. And Jennifer Neary is a licensed acupuncturist and wellness tycoon at Clinic Alternatives Medicines. She has served on the Greater Northampton Chamber of Commerce's board of directors for 3 years and has been on its nominating committee for 4 years. And Jen has been a dynamo in taking the helm at the Chamber in its efforts to diversify not only its board of directors, but also its mission. So Jen, I'm gonna pitch the first ball to you today, if that's okay. So maybe you can start us off by telling us what's the background of this event? Why are we here today? What motivated the Chamber to host this event on diversifying boards?
Great, thanks, Deborah. Yes, so as you might have heard in the introduction, I've been on the nominations committee of the Chamber for longer than I've been on the board of the Chamber. My journey with the Chamber here, and not to dismiss any of the support that I've gotten, which has been a ton. Everyone has been on board for these changes and has been really excited to see greater diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Chamber. So it's been a real team effort. But I'll just speak from my point of view, which is, so I started my journey with the Chamber by being asked to be on the nominating committee. So I had just been a Chamber member for quite a while and was asked to join the nominations committee. My experience there was 5 white people of all about the same age, probably maybe a 20-year spread, sitting in a small room, talking for 2 days about how important diversity is, and having no means of finding any greater diversity. So we all agreed that it was a priority, and no one had any idea of how to achieve it. So in the course of that nominations process, I was nominated to the board, and I basically agreed to join with the single-minded agenda of creating better diversity within the Chamber board, within the Chamber staff, within the Chamber membership, within the business community of Northampton, and ideally, way out in the future, aiming to diversify Northampton itself. So, so that's been my driving force on the Chamber throughout my time here. So I continued on the nominations committee every year, and every year we've refined the process. So it's been an ongoing process, but the great news is that we have come up with a process that seems to be working. We've achieved greater diversity this year than we had than we've ever had on the Chamber board. and hoping for even greater diversity and greater equity and inclusion, especially in coming years. So what the real exciting part is that I feel like we're finally to a point where we can start to share our sort of best practices in DEI in terms of recruiting for the board. And I know that everyone in the area is working on these projects, and I'm eager to start a conversation where we can share what we've done, and hopefully other organizations can share what they've done, because I know everyone's been working on different angles, and I think probably putting our heads together, we can really amplify DEI in all of our organizations much more rapidly. So I'm very excited about that.
Thank you, Jen. I love that you took the approach that, you were going to study what to do, you were going to do it. And then once you got to a point where you felt like you'd done it fairly successfully, now you want to share the knowledge. And now you want to encourage your colleagues and other businesses in the area to do the same thing. So I love that that was sort of the motivation and the way that you're paying it forward. So Kevin, I'm going to ask the next question to you. What goes wrong when boards don't diversify? And I'm going to ask you this from several different angles. So as a Black man who has served on a board, not in the role of president, and then moving into the role of president of the board, and then also as someone who works as a social worker in a human service agency, and also in your role as an anti-racism trainer, training many agencies across the state, what goes wrong when boards don't diversify? And particularly, what goes wrong when boards don't have racial diversity? You are muted.
Saw that. Well, thank you all for being here. First of all, Deborah, I wanted to address this from a helicopter view. That's a big question, and it's a great question, and it's a complex question. What goes wrong when boards don't diversify? I guess I'll start by saying, homogenous thinking tends to reinforce the status quo. When there's no conflict in ideology, there's no synergy in progress. I want everybody here to take one moment and imagine a world with one color paint. How about one protein or one vegetable? From there, I say you have to look at it as anything worth doing deserves infinite possibilities. And this is my favorite quote before I go into depth of answering the question. Albert Einstein once said, "You cannot solve a problem with the same mind that created it." And I think a lot of times when we're looking for solutions, when we're looking at change, how can we look at a homogeneous history and expect to see alternative outcomes in our future? So diversity, what does diversity do? And I'll come back to this in a minute, but as a Black man, served on a board, not in the role of president, and then moving to the role of board president, wow. That was an interesting transition for me. I, like Jennifer, right, came onto a board that basically had a handful of white people. And there was one Latinx person from the other side of the state who showed up every once in a while, who had really great credentials, and it was nice having his name on the board. And I listened to them do the same programming over and over. But I also heard from the Black community that they were not engaged. I heard from the Western Mass community, they were not engaged. I heard from the South Shore. I heard from women. I kept hearing that there were these marginalized groups, and diversity wasn't really, for me, just about getting BIPOC people engaged. Diversity for me was about getting everyone engaged. So as a social worker, I had to look at it from a social service problem. How do I get services to marginalized groups within the groups that are supposed to be served? So take the recovery community, for example, which is what I work in, right? Alcohol and drug addiction has carried a stigma for decades. And the association of BIPOC communities to alcohol and drug addiction had made it almost impossible to get support for programming within their communities. It was considered their problem. Then in 2010, I woke up one morning and we had an opioid epidemic. And money was flowing in from everywhere, state and federal. And as a Black man and a social worker, I realized that that was because the problem spread outside Route 128. It was now in the bedroom communities and the white communities in Massachusetts. So what had been considered a urban color problem was now an epidemic. And that came from a homogenous set of thinking that had gone on over and over and over again for a long time. So in looking at that, I had to say to myself, you know, when I was asked to join the board, you know, I could see that the role and strategies were still limited. The organization had developed a reputation for advocating for some organizations and some peoples and not others. So when you do not have racial diversity in a board, two things happen, okay? First, the BIPOC community is less likely to engage with this organization. There's a lack of trust from the community, especially from the communities of color or the not represented communities, because they're not represented within the industries and the organizations that are supposed to be supporting them. Secondly, organization and industries lose touch with the needs of the people that they are designed to serve. You know, and I think that's really the major problem. If you are not hearing from community leaders and leaders of different segments of the community, then you are not utilizing the voice that needs to be heard in making your decisions on how to serve. And I think that in and of itself is why diversity is so important. And I will end by saying, I not only diversified the board racially, I also diversified the board by gender and by region and by profession, so that I got input now from the medical fields, from the non-addiction treatment fields, from other social service agencies, and the mental health field. And for me, I think that was what it was meant to be, diversity. And insofar as doing that, anti-racism became an integral part in addressing the issues of how to communicate with these marginalized and the BIPOC communities.
Thank you, Kevin. And, you know, I think you address a really particular lens and particular problem that our country has yet to reckon with, which is, we all know that, when maybe everybody doesn't know if you haven't taken our training or if you haven't been reading about it, that the war on drugs was really a war on Black and brown communities and has had a devastating impact and continues to have a devastating impact. You know, we look at sentencing in Massachusetts, where you know, Black men charged with the same crimes, the same offenses as white men have 168 longer days on average to their sentences. For Latinx men, it's 148 days longer. So, you know, we think sometimes that Massachusetts is a bubble of social justice and that somehow things are going better here. We know that there's actually still a lot of problems. And so, Kevin, I appreciate you bringing that lens, because for anybody who's in the nonprofit sector, who's addressing social services, the issues of addiction and the differences in the ways that white communities have been treated and offered social services versus Black and brown communities being offered incarceration, that has a devastating life impact to not only individuals, but the communities. You know, that's a critical area we have to put our lens. And certainly having people on the board of directors who make that a priority is critical. So thank you for sharing that. So Jeff, your turn. I got one for you. Can you please share with us At Cooley Dickinson, what was the wake-up moment? Was there a wake-up moment? Has Cooley Dickinson's board always been diverse all along? Or was there a particular incident or experience that sort of shifted a focus to bringing diversity on the board? Kind of tell us a little bit about your journey.
Thanks, and first of all, just good morning to everybody. I know several of you. It's really great to see you again. There really was no particular moment, no wake-up moment, no incident that caused us to think more about diversity. I would describe it more as gradual, and I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing, but also give a little bit of background on how healthcare is changing. And I think going in that direction, maybe build a little bit on Kevin's comments. So I think when we think about where we are right now in healthcare, the days where you would break your leg or something bad would happen and you would come in and we would fix you and bill your insurance company, that's really not how things work anymore. We certainly do all of that, but we really think much more proactively now about why are you sick to begin with and how can we be more proactive? And so we think about things like the social determinants of health, and some of you have heard those terms, but in case you haven't, those are those areas of life that we all need, such as housing and transportation, education, jobs. And we know that through systemic racism in our society, many people don't have equal access. And sooner or later, that unequal access does show up oftentimes in our emergency department. And so we have to think more proactively, strategically, collaboratively than we've ever had to before. And on that front, we now are able to do more screening on social determinants of health, particularly with respect to access to food systems and access to housing through the Mass Health program, which is Massachusetts' version of Medicaid. And there actually is a little bit of a little pool of money that we can pull from to actually make a difference in people's lives. I know it might sound like common sense and obvious that we should do this, but we've never had this opportunity before. And I think this is a direction that's a real game changer for healthcare in our country if we can sustain it and just think more integrated in more integrated ways, think more in systems and think more about how we collaborate with others in the community. And so I think by my comments, you can see why you really need that diversity of perspective that Kevin mentioned. You have to think differently, and you need more variety of thoughts and voices into the mix to make better decisions. So a few things that we are doing at Cooley Dickinson that I think are moving us more and more towards where we want to be. First of all, many of you may know that we are a member of the Massachusetts Mass General Brigham, that's a new name for us, it used to be Partners Healthcare, Mass General Brigham Healthcare System. And together we have a United Against Racism plan, and Cooley Dickinson has its own version of that plan that was approved by our board. And I'll give you just a couple of examples of things we're doing. One is we are looking at all of our clinical policies to make sure that we're not inadvertently causing harm to people unnecessarily. And we know over the years, plenty of research has been done on white men. Not nearly enough research has been done on people who aren't white men. And so we have to just look at our policies with fresh eyes and see where we can maybe make changes. Like, do we really need that lab value that's based on someone's race? Or is that just kind of a red herring? So those are detailed examples of where we need to look. We also know that our patients have better experiences when they have providers who look like them. And I think that may be particularly true for our African-American patients. I read some research recently that shows that in healthcare, we often undertreat pain when it's an African-American person. And so having that doctor or that nurse who looks like you do can be really important. And so to that end, we are looking at our recruiting practices. We're looking at job descriptions and hiring practices and promotion practices. And where can we make improvements? Where can we maybe not have a job requirement that knocks somebody out in the running for that job when it really isn't that necessary to begin with? So we're looking at all of that. And then the last comment I'll make is, in terms of what we're doing, is looking at staff training. We've done a lot of staff training. We have more to go. I feel really fortunate that Mass General Brigham is offering so much. We don't have to reinvent the wheel locally. We just get access to all these great trainings and great speakers. Unconscious bias, understanding different cultures, understanding white privilege, just to name a few examples of things that we're doing. So I feel like moving in the right direction, still plenty more work to be done, but I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Deborah.
Thanks, Jeff. I appreciate you talking about the social determinants of health. You know, we know that many prominent organizations have talked about racism being a public health crisis. We know that, you know, there's been a lot of data that's come out that you alluded to about Black people in particular being undertreated for pain, the risk of death due to maternity-related reasons is 3 times higher for Black women and Native American women than white women, all due to preventable causes related to racism. We know that there's just been a range of different studies. Last year, there was a study that came out that showed that the survival rate of Black infants is higher when their care is managed by Black doctors and nurses, right? So there's just so much that we need to put our lens to in the field of public health. So I appreciate you acknowledging all that and bringing our attention to that. So before we start going into the how-tos, that what have you all done? How did you go about diversifying your board? Because we know that's what everybody wants to know here, right? Like, what do I do? We know it's a problem. We know we want more diversity on our board, but I just want to invite Vince into the conversation and hear a little bit from you, Vince. Why was diversifying the board important to you? How did it feel when your staff, your entire staff, and so many members of the board of the Chamber of Commerce decided to go through the Interrupting Racism trainings with us last summer and to decide to really commit to this process to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion in general, but racial equity in particular? What were your hopes and concerns in this process?
Well, first, let me say that when I joined the Chamber as Executive Director a couple of years ago, we were celebrating our centennial. It was a true turning point for the Northampton Chamber. And the diversity goals were baked into the strategic plan, and therefore it was tied to my performance. So when you hear the cliche that it starts at the top, the board was already engaged. They had already laid the foundation and the plan. They just didn't tell you how we would get there. And we didn't know how we would get there. But I will say that there were several champions, Jen Neary, and I see Ruth Griggs here from our board who is on this call, and Heidi Norton-Smith, folks who were really doing the heavy lifting and gaining the traction needed to move forward. So with me, you know, they had invested and hired in an African-American leader, and I had no reason not to believe that we would make this happen. So nothing has surprised me, but I am very surprised at how accelerated the pace has been. And I'll tell you exactly where we are. We went from having 1 person of color on the board to now having 4 persons of color, including me, or not including me as a 5th person because I'm not a voting member of the board, but that's a huge shift in 1 year. And we also went from having 3 millennials to now 6 millennials. And that's important to the point that Kevin made earlier. You've got to invite more people with more ideas to be at the table. And that was so important for the Chamber because even in our national organization that we are affiliated with, there's a concern that the Chamber perception is not going to sustain us as an organization because the image and the perception is just that it's successful old white guys in suits. And we know that that is not the Northampton Chamber. So having those millennials represented, and I also have to say that of the 6 millennials now on the board, only 1 is male. And we have 3 members of the LGBTQ community on the board. So when you think about those 3 primary groups, persons of color, millennials, as well as LGBTQ, we are so pleased with the impact and the progress and the traction that we've gained behind a goal that was set in the strategic plan. So when it's baked in and your leadership is on board, no pun intended, it can happen. And no concerns whatsoever, because I just know that there are champions on the board who have seen the opportunity, and as both Jeff and Kevin have said, when there's diversity in thought, there's diversity in experiences and backgrounds, you get more optimized solutions, you get greater ideas, you're more poised for growth, and you certainly engage more people. And we have experienced all of that and then some. So I'm excited to be part of this process.
Thanks, Vince. And I appreciate that you talked about how diversifying boards isn't just the right thing to do, but it's actually better for business. And there have been numerous studies that have pointed to this, that innovation is increased, that worker satisfaction is increased, that clients prefer doing businesses with companies and organizations that reflect their own social identities, right? That there's a greater sense of energy and synergy when there are all different perspectives that are at the table. And so I appreciate you sort of naming that. We're not just doing this because we're in Northampton, we always try to do the right socially just thing, but that we know it makes sense. So thank you for acknowledging that. So let's dive into the conversation now. Jen, we're gonna bring you back in here, and maybe you can start off this part of the conversation now. What was your process for diversifying the board of directors of the Chamber of Commerce? How did you do it?
All right, so I'm going to share a screen, and hopefully I can do that successfully. Okay. There we go. All righty. So yeah, so I've got a little slideshow here prepared by Lou at the Chamber. Thank you, Lou. So basically, wanted to kind of talk you through the whole process that we now go through. And again, I'm very excited to share as much as possible with all of you in terms of just sort of the hard-nosed details about how to get this done. So I'll just give you a sketch here, and please feel free to ask questions and ask questions later, request documents, that sort of thing. We're really open to sharing as much as possible. So basically, my main point is, if you want a more diverse board, have a process. So as I said earlier, what I walked into on my first day of the nominating committee for the board was a bunch of people wishing that we could have a more diverse board. You're not going to get there by wishing. You're not going to get there by asking the one non-white person you know. That was sort of the tone of the conversation when I walked into it. So you need to have goals. You need to have rubrics, and you need to measure your success. And I'll talk you through how we've done that. So I talked a little bit about where we started, and this is where we've ended up. And it's still a work in progress. We're still refining every year, but we've definitely gotten to a point where the process is laid out, and now we just have to go through it with some occasional revisions year to year. Let's see here. There we go. Okay, so we do our nominations process in 6 phases. So phase 1 is create the nominations committee. Try to make it as diverse as you can. So we all have, I think, limitations on who can be on a nominations committee or nominating committee. We need to make it as diverse as you can within those limitations. And thinking about diversity, for us, thinking about diversity included a broad interpretation of diversity. So sex, gender, age, race, socioeconomic status, disability, etc., are all considerations for us. So what you're trying to do in phase 1 is figure out what it would take to have a representative and effective board. So figure out what it would mean to represent the community. In your case, the community that you are attempting to represent. So the Chamber's new agenda is to support the whole community via the business community, for the business community, in conjunction with the business community, but really the focus is much broader. So it's not just about representing the people who are currently running businesses in town. So so we're at the same time, we're trying to broaden our goals in terms of who we're trying to represent. We're trying to broaden our vision, and that means we have to represent different kinds of people. So in phase one, we set goals. We survey the board for demographics, alongside skill sets, industry, that sort of thing, because we're trying to get a lot of different kinds of diversity. So we have a survey that goes out to all of the board members, and at the same time, we're talking to the executive director, the staff, executive committees, consulting the bylaws, et cetera, to make sure that we're meeting all the different kinds of diversity that we need. We're setting, sorry, where is that? We're setting our goals about diversity. We at the Chamber set our goals based on the census report. So we just looked up the census numbers for Northampton and for Massachusetts, and set goals accordingly. I mean, obviously, creating a board with 15 out of 21 BIPOC members would be really cool, but is that likely? Is it even representative of our community? We had a lot of conversations about how to set those goals, and we decided to try to make the constitution of our board match the constitution of the community. So we came up with numbers that we were trying to meet, and we went out and sought input. So for phase two, we reached out to the community via the Chamber's newsletter, via social media, via direct connections with other organizations. And one thing we learned from John Bidwell particularly was to ask for any specific needs that we're looking to meet. So we had sort of said diversity, equity, and inclusion is important to our organization, but we hadn't said we are looking for more Latinx people, which John asked us to ask, and we asked him, and he gave us a great list of people. So we learned most recently that we really need to ask for the concrete characteristics that we're looking for. Contacts in the media, BIPOC folks, veterans, people with disabilities. Really just being very specific about what we're looking for, and looking to connect with organizations that represent those folks is also going to be really, really helpful. Phase four, we interview the candidates that we've had nominated. Deborah pointed out to us at some point along the way that interviews should be conducted by two people, and again, trying to keep each interview set as diverse as possible. We want to make candidates who are from other backgrounds feel as comfortable as possible. Also, we want to exclude bias as much as possible in those interviews. Creating interview sets, and then following a rubric for those interviews. So having questions laid out in advance, and having each of the interviewers sort of rate the responses on each of the questions. Again, trying to eliminate points where bias can creep in. We found that it was really important for us to state throughout the process, including here, that the importance, state what the importance of DEI is to our organization. So we had actually, the Chamber had put out a statement on Black Lives Matter the previous summer, the summer prior to our last process. And that was really great because we could just share that statement and ask for responses. And, everyone was at least, nominally approved of it, but it really evoked some interesting responses from several several of the candidates. Many people asked what particularly we were doing about this, that there wasn't, that we couldn't just toss out a pronouncement about Black Lives Matter and let that be the end of it. So it really brought out, so it really emphasized who was dedicated to DEI and was going to be a good partner for us in that. Phase 5, select the new board members. According to your own procedures and bylaws, you would select the slate and have whoever vote on it votes. And phase 6, make sure to thank everyone, thank all the nominators, thank all the people who submitted questionnaires, thank all the people who didn't get nominated or didn't get chosen for the board, and invite them to join our work in other ways. After that, and this is sort of the new frontier for our process, is making sure that an onboarding orientation is done, and consider sort of a big sibling program to get the new members settled in to the board. We know that not only is representation of people of color, etc., an issue, like just are they present, but also can they speak? Do they feel comfortable? Do they feel like their vision and their thoughts are reflected in the board? So really trying to make sure that we get them settled in well, and make sure that they feel comfortable speaking and voicing their opinions is super important too. And that is it. Thanks.
Great, Jen. Thank you for sharing it with us. It's really helpful to hear sort of the step-by-step process and all of the considerations that went into each phase of your process and of your project to diversify the board. So thank you. So let's bring it now to Kevin. When you and I first started speaking, as you shared earlier, there was only one other person of color that was on your board who was on the other side of the state, not able to make a lot of the meetings. So for all intents and purposes, you were dealing with a very white board. So how did you do it? What were the steps that you took to diversify the board?
Well, actually, it was organic. I'm going to say that, Deborah, a lot of it, it diversified itself. And what do I mean by that? It eventually became so homogenous that the thoughts and actions, there was no reason for board members to stay. And so the board started losing members, losing interest. They faded away. They all knew the others would agree with what the executive director and president of the board said. They all thought alike. There was no creativity. Eventually, the same 5 people would show up and have the same discussion and listen to the same report month after month. There was no debate. There was no dissension. There was no conflict. They had the same meetings with the same politicians and the same institutions. Every couple of meetings, I would come up with an idea or a suggestion, right? All of a sudden, there was something to talk about. Even if it was just like, oh, we don't want to go down that lane. We don't want to go in that direction. Even if it was just pushback to my suggestions, it started forcing people to think outside the box, We all know that no one likes change. They began to challenge the new ideas, but in order to do that, they had to come up with some new ideas of their own. So I noticed after a while, more board members were showing up for meetings. And then the topic of diversity came up. I think that was about the time that they were talking about human in common. And we started to talk about DEI and the fact that we're a statewide organization. And as I said before, diversity meant representation from around the state. Diversity meant gender identification, representation, ethnicity, race, geography. It also meant profession and areas of expertise. So it was interesting that Jen mentioned it, right? Oh, we all just, can we ask that one person of color that we know, right? And I was more like, what? How am I going to do this? And I sat with self and I talked to some of the board members about it, and I said, and I asked everyone to go out and try to come up with 3 candidates on the board. And after 2 months of crickets, right, as we like to say, I decided that, okay, I need to take this into my own hands. And I started with my LinkedIn network. And I looked at the diversity in my LinkedIn network. But secondly, what I started to do is I wrote myself a little elevator speech, and I just started to reach out to people. Matter of fact, I'd cut and paste it. People that were second or third, that were diverse, or the type of people that I thought may be interested in our mission. One of the things that's complex about the mission at Moore is, right, half of the board members, according to our charter, have to be of lived experience. And you can't always find that out on LinkedIn. So a lot of it was me just beating the streets, but talking to people in the recovery community. And the next thing I knew, people were circling back to me and talking to me about the organization. And for me, it was, I started talking about mission first. Were they aligned? Did you want to be aligned? And whether or not they wanted to serve second. But it did 2 things. I started talking to more people. We have more people that are not on our board that are still more involved now than there were before. But what was really interesting is I went from that handful of people. We now have a board that has 5 people of color, 5 women, and 3 millennials. And they represent Western Mass, Central Mass, South Shore, and North Shore. And so, but for me, that was just the beginning. I think it was, I needed this sort of foundation, which took me about a year to put together, 8 months. And now that we have this group, we're starting to do some of the things that Jen really talked about. We're starting to form and restructure our committees. We're starting to create our nominating committees. We're starting to build this into our next strategic plan, so that in perpetuity, the board continues to be diverse, you know? So for me, you know, I took the anti-racism training, and I met 2 like minds who are now on the board today, okay? And that was the tip of the iceberg. And since then, we continue to work with a DEI lens, and I think that that's really what's important. And we will structure. We don't do anything now as a board without bringing diversity, equity, inclusion into our next steps, which are going to be some changes that are coming down the line. And so I think it really takes the impetus of certain specific individuals and a desire to be diverse to begin the process of making that happen. And I was fortunate that I was in the right place at the right time. And I believe that our organization is better for it. With thanks.
So Kevin alluded to this training last spring that he came to. It was one of our advanced level interrupting racism trainings. And there were these 2 people who were very outspoken, and they were really bright, and they were so impactful. So we started sending each other private messages on Zoom and saying, hey, Kevin, you got to get their emails. And that's a great little tip. You go to anti-racism trainings, and sometimes you'll see that there are people there who are absolute dynamos. That's actually a great place to, you know, recruit if you're looking for folks to join your board or your organization. So thank you for sharing that, Kevin. And so Jeff, we'd love to hear from you. What were your strategies for recruiting people of marginalized social identities who are too often underrepresented on boards? What steps did you take to ensure that their needs are being met, that they feel valued and heard? Because we know very often folks of color in particular will join a board and just feel invisible, dismissed, frustrated, and will leave, you know, within a year. There's that revolving door because of, you know, white supremacy culture. And so tell me a little bit about how you found people and how you keep people on your board.
Yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, let's keep in mind, this is a journey. I feel like I'm on the panel, but I'm also taking notes from other people on the panel, getting some ideas. So like most nonprofits, board members are typically invited to be on a committee first. it's rare that someone goes directly onto a board. And so we are always on the lookout for someone who we think might be interested and be a good committee member. And we have, I believe, 5 or so committees. We have a few people on the that I'm seeing today who are on some of our committees. I also want to mention that there are other ways to engage and participate that aren't necessarily board or board committee level. We have a patient family advisory council. We also have a community benefit advisory council. So there are lots of ways that people can engage with various levels of commitment, of time and energy. And oftentimes we find that some people are pretty happy just staying at that level of time commitment, while others may feel like, I can really put a little extra into this, and I really want to stick my teeth into it and learn more and do more. And those are the kind of folks who may find themselves at some point nominated to be on the full board, and then maybe eventually being asked to be on the board. I think one thing that is, in our experience is very different from what Kevin described is that it sounds like Kevin had more of kind of a rebuilding opportunity. When I look at like a hospital board, hospitals and healthcare systems are very complex organizations to run. And typically board members find themselves staying on for some period of time. The board terms are 3 years, and you can be on for 3 years. 3 terms. So it's a total of 9 years. So we don't have a lot of turnover. So anyway, I just wanted to address that. I want to also address the issue of money. When I think back to what boards used to be like and the functions of boards, back in, whenever earlier, oftentimes it was bring your checkbook. Who can bring a nice fat wallet or checkbook to the game? And oftentimes that was, who do you know, who do you play golf with, and all of that. And for the reasons I described earlier, and the others I've described earlier, that doesn't cut it anymore. We need board members who, yeah, we do want people to give us money, but we want a lot more than that. And so at Cooley Dickinson, I don't know when, but at some point the decision was made to ask board members to make sure that Cooley Dickinson is one of their top 3 places to donate, but there's no dollar amount that's expected. And we think it's important that people give something just because it demonstrates commitment, but that can be whatever is comfortable for that person. And I think that's just important to know, or to say that, because people of color, particularly Black people in our country, have not had the opportunity to build intergenerational wealth because of systemic racism in our society. And so just to acknowledge that money is a topic that has to be discussed and is part of it, but there are different ways to have that conversation. In terms of making sure that new board members are feeling valued, heard, feeling that the contributions are valued, I think it's a really important question, because when you asked that question, Deborah, I was really hearing in part, this is a conversation about culture, board culture and organizational culture. And I think it's important that we recognize that when we join a new organization, there is some aspect of assimilating into that culture. But on the other hand, there's also an aspect of the organizational culture changing and adapting to new people who are coming on. That's the whole point of having diverse thought on your board. And so, Kevin mentioned earlier, people don't like change, and a lot of us don't. But on the other hand, to recognize that culture change is an opportunity that you've got to take, because that's really the whole point. And there are ways that you can do that. So I'll give you just a couple of examples. Our board now does something that it doesn't take a lot of time, but I think it's really important. Our board chair puts diversity on every agenda, and there's an activity or discussion or just something to keep the importance of diversity alive and in front of everybody with regularity. And so it's intentionally stating this is important, and we're going to spend time on it. So I think that's really one way that boards can take some concrete steps to just make sure that people feel heard and included. Another way I mentioned earlier is training making sure that board members have opportunities for training, participation in that, and are encouraged, whether it's as a board or on their own time, just keeping that information in front of people as often as we can. So I staff the Healthy Communities Committee, which is a committee of the board, and we have regular diversity, equity, and inclusion agenda items. We watch videos and then have conversations, things like that. So again, it's just that steady drumbeat of bringing that lens to the conversation. I think it's that opportunity to improve patient care, opportunity to improve the way we interface with the community and collaborate with the community. So I'll leave, I was gonna leave it there. There's one more thing I wanna say. One of our African-American doctors, who is often asked to be a spokesperson or be on boards or whatnot, describes a phenomenon she calls the being or having the black tax, where maybe a relatively few people in a community like ours, which is 80% white. And so African-American folks may find themselves experiencing the black tax, where they're being asked to do a lot, maybe more than their share. And although, you know, I'm sure people are happy to give their time and participate, it can also become a burden. And so I think, you know, you want to be careful to not over ask. The timing should be right. And you just want to have the conversation and give people other ways to participate that may be a little more friendly to their time.
Great, Jeff. Thank you. Appreciate your thoughtful details there. I love that Cooley Dickinson actually has a number of different types of committees to allow people to participate at different levels, to be able to focus on specific topics, to have different levels of time commitment, because sometimes boards are rather rigid in their expectations, and it doesn't always work for people with kids or with different work schedules. So appreciate you sharing that aspect as well. And then also making sure that diversity, equity, inclusion in some concrete way is always on the agenda at your meetings, and linking that to the experience of patient care, recognizing there is actually a direct line between what the board is doing and what the patients are experiencing. So thank you for sharing that. Let's hear now from John. John Bidwell, the United Way of Hampshire County generously agreed to contribute $10,000 to fund our Interrupting Racism training series that's open to nonprofits and businesses in Hampshire County. And this is going to allow human services professionals and other non-for-profits to attend at no cost. Why did the United Way decide to do this, and what does this mean to you?
Well, thanks to you, and thanks to Vince and everybody involved with this, and all the participants for being here today. This is really important stuff. I wanted to say, of course, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, the JEDI issues are extremely vital, but they're complicated. Not everyone in an organization, nor every organization has the same experience, even if they share race, gender, whatever. It isn't clear that there's one path that fits all, which can be really frustrating for organizations that are trying to deal with this. We're all addressing an issue that's baked into the fabric of our culture for hundreds of years. So as impatient as we get, it's important to remember that this is going to take sustained work to really turn things around. We started to take a closer look at this a couple of years ago, because our board has always had very good representation in terms of diversity, with the exception of people of color. That's been the one piece that's been a big challenge. And so a couple of years ago, we pulled together a BIPOC committee that was solely a BIPOC committee to talk about this issue. And I think it was really important that it was a standalone group that got together to come back. And they basically told us that for them to consider being in leadership in an organization in the Valley, it's important that the organization shows support and is serious. And that means that it's serious in word, it's serious in action, and it's serious in resources. And this is important because nobody, regardless of gender, sex, color, wants to feel like they're tokenized. Nobody wants to feel that they're just in a place to check off a box. So while this doesn't give us a specific roadmap for everybody, it's given us a pretty good idea of the process that we need to follow. And there's 4 pieces to this process. The first is a public show of support. You have to, these are your words, right? These are the words that you go out to your community to say, this is important to us. And so we put up a racial solidarity statement last spring. We include it in our news. We include it in our social media posts. We're showing that we're engaged. The words are very important. We need to tell people that this is important to us. 2, we need to back up our words with action. And that's where the grants like this come in, right? It's one thing to just get the words out there, but we need to back that, and we need to back it with, and some of the other actions that are included are the fact that we've created a standing diversity committee that's part of our board. It's not an ad hoc committee. It's not a temporary committee. It's not a committee until we feel like we've gotten certain things done. It is a standing committee, and it's getting baked into our bylaws. That's really important. And one of the best ways to show that you're committed is through resources. So we put money aside to give grants for these types of trainings to make sure that other organizations benefit. 3, you have to educate internally. So we are in the process right now with that standing DEI committee to educate our board. It's that steady drumbeat that Jeff was talking about. And as a matter of fact, we're lucky that Jeff happens to be the head of our DEI committee for right now, which is fantastic. But you've got to educate your board, you've got to educate your staff, and in our case, we have to educate our partner agencies. Again, never assume that everybody at the table has the same experience or the same viewpoints. It's been remarkable through these educational tools and these educational opportunities to see the breadth of conversation that's come out of it and experiences. You got to keep at it. And then fourth is you got to bake this into your policy. Like I said, we have this committee that is in our bylaws. And in our case, as we start strategic planning this summer, we're going to be looking much more closely at our grants process and how we can tie specific goals having to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Again, baking it into the system. This is really important because if you want to attract a diverse group to your board, to your leadership, you need to show that you're taking these things really seriously. I think the one word that I think is most important to take away is one that I've taken from Brian Stevenson. I don't know if you know Brian Stevenson, a lawyer, social activist, wrote the book Just Mercy. And the word that he often uses is proximity. You have to have proximity to the people that you're helping. You have to have proximity to the cause that you're undertaking. And it doesn't make any difference if you're uncomfortable. It doesn't make any difference if it's difficult. It doesn't make any difference if it's going to take a while. You have to maintain that proximity, because if you don't, you're not going to stand a chance of getting anything else done. So why these grants? These grants are our way of putting our money where our mouth is. It's our way of showing that we're committed to the community. It's our way of spreading the education, and it's our way of hoping that other organizations can benefit from this.
Wow. That was beautiful, John. I really appreciate the way that you laid that out so clearly. That, as we all said right from the beginning, that this has to be systematized. There has to be a plan. It has to be consistent. There has to be follow through. And so the fact that you and the United Way really walk the walk and not just talk the talk, I just want to say that we really appreciate it and all that you're doing. So thank you for being such great trailblazers and role models in that. And so now I want to come on back to you, Vince. I'd love to hear from you. I'm sure we'd all love to hear from you. So it's been, you said a year, but it's really been less than a year, because I remember when your team went through the training and started the process, that I think was last August. And so really it's been less than a year and you've had these incredible results. So can you tell us, what are some of these positive results from diversifying the board? How has the board and the chamber as an organization benefited by becoming more diverse? And how have people of color in the county benefited from the chamber's mission to become not only more diverse, but intentionally committed to racial equity?
Well, thank you for that question, Deborah. And I will say that for our board members who are people of color, and all of the ones who filled gaps, I say you were brought on to fill a gap, and I have to say that they are serving in those gaps. So some of the results have been, one, expanded networks. We find often, due to the history of subjugation in this country, that in communities of color, There are already existing affinity groups that are mission focused to advance the causes in those communities. So tapping into those networks has been a win for the Chamber, where we didn't have to recreate the wheel. Well, we didn't, we wanted to expand our services to be more inclusive. So that shared networking has been one of the most powerful benefits. And we also see that there are geographic benefits because our board members may work in Springfield, but live in Northampton. So they've been able to bring more people on board to understand the role of the Chamber in our community. They brought the different skill set that we never thought that we needed because we never reached out. Like one of our Latinx members said, if you need this really important work translated in Spanish, I can do that for you. So now we're able to provide that, bilingual lens that we haven't been able to provide before. So a number of concrete examples, and from our, 6 millennials, their passion, energy, just they're a different kind of folk. So we have benefited from their fresh ideas and their great thinking and their big ideas and their bold, fearless leadership that has helped advance the Chamber in incredible ways. So I'm just excited about that. And, we're also doing some things to continue the momentum. And as John said, put our money where our mouth is. We spend, hundreds of thousands of dollars, as any nonprofit does, on products and services. And we are making an intentional effort to diversify our vendor mix. So when we are procuring products and services, we make sure that we have in that mix qualified, underrepresented vendors to help us stay true to what we say we're about, which is a thriving economy and a thriving community. So that's one thing. And also for those investors whom we used to refer to as members, we want to make sure that those who have been underrepresented are represented. So if you go to our website now, we call them out, they're listed, their products and services are featured. And there are so many folks in the community when we issue statements of solidarity with specific groups. How can I support? Where can I go to buy things that I always buy? Now the Chamber is a resource and a catalyst for making sure that that information is available. And then finally, let me just say that there's a level of pride that I feel, and it's a two-way exchange, I believe, when I'm walking down the street and a person of color or someone who's not of color will say, I appreciate what you're doing at the Chamber, and they mention DEI in a way that's noticed and is meaningful and valuable. I just got a note this morning from a woman in the community who said, thank you for your newsletter yesterday. And I just appreciate how you are including everyone in the community. So that's incredibly valuable. And it just gives us at the Chamber a sense of pride with a dose of humility behind what we're doing.
I can't thank you enough, Vince and your team, what you're doing. I mean, it's so impactful, and our team benefits from it. We are committed to trying to spend our dollars on businesses that are owned by people of color. And up until a year ago, there was no way to easily do that. But the fact that you've created this directory, this resource guide, that you sent out a survey so that you could find out which businesses are owned by people of color, or what are the women-owned businesses, or what are LGBTQ-owned business, or disability or veteran. I mean, that's really powerful. So for businesses that want to be able to make those ethical choices, that is so powerful. And I look very excitedly forward each week to see the Community Connector, to see what you put in it. Because besides including our little tidbits here, you've been putting some really powerful statements of solidarity and support and inviting others to take meaningful action. So I think it's been really powerful. I'm going to share all with you a couple of tips from Human in Common, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A. So I'm going to bring up my screen to share with you. And can everybody see it? I get a nod. All right, so a couple of thoughts. So you know who I am, so I'll just skip right over that. And so we use something called a racial equity impact assessment tool. And if you all go to the chat box, I'm going to ask my colleague and friend Kate McConnell if you can post that folder there. So in the chat now we have a Google folder, and in it is something called a racial equity impact assessment tool. I want to encourage all of you to open that up and download it before logging off today. This is a tool that a lot of people don't know about. This is something we use at Human in Common with our clients. A racial equity impact assessment tool is a way of making decisions, a way of creating policies and programs that can actually amplify diversity, equity, and inclusion in general, or racial equity in particular, rather than having it just sort of an add-on at the end. And so what it does is it uses data to estimate the impact of decisions on particular populations. And there's all different forms. We're happy to share ours with you that we created. It provides basically a systematic way of engaging voices and opinions of those who will be impacted, people of marginalized social identity group. And it considers the unintended consequences before making any decisions. And it allows for a wider range of policy or program options. And so I call it an REIA because it's a big mouthful, Racial Equity Impact Assessment Tool, demonstrates a real commitment to racial equity. Too often we hear organizations decide that, a few white people at the top are going to just decide what the racial equity strategic plan is, or the diversity strategic plan. We have a client that's just signing on for services with us. And we met with them a few weeks ago and we said, well, how are you approaching this? They basically said that, sort of the 3 white people at the top were going to make a racial equity plan, and then they were going to pull together a diverse group of people and tell them what that plan was. And we said, well, maybe we could flip that order a little bit. And so we basically are trying to engage them in using this tool, which is actually both a template and a process for making change. So it's a way of examining policies and promoting racial equity and recognizing so many ways that racial equity can be embedded in policies and practices. And so it offers a really specific means for evaluating decisions, and it focuses on a very inclusive process. So there's accountability and transparency built right in. So we hope that you'll all open it up and use this. You can always call us if you need some help with it. We're happy to come on in and work with your organization. But what's really powerful is it demonstrates a meaningful commitment to your members, to your staff, to those you serve, that you're actually really committed to equity. And so in terms of process, yes, we ask you to use a racial equity and impact assessment tool, but even stepping back a little bit, we think it's really important to start off by having some clarity about what do you mean by diversity? And that means, looking at your organization, looking at those you serve, looking at who's represented and who's not. And to really get clear, as some of the folks on the panel talked about, how will diversity improve the efficacy of the board? How will it diversify and support the mission of the organization? Who are we serving? Who are the demographics in our area? Who's missing? Whose voices are missing, right? And so what kind of results are we hoping to get out of this? And using whatever local data you can. And so we like this cartoon. And when we think about the barriers to racial equity, one of the terms that we use a lot, the expressions that we use a lot, is white cloning. We talk about this a lot in our training. And white cloning is basically this practice of having predominantly white boards that then make the executive hire, and often will choose a white person to be at the top. And then this executive director with the white board makes the policies, the practices, the priorities, the budget, and so it just keeps replicating white supremacy culture. And occasionally, maybe there's a token person of color on the board who usually leaves pretty quickly, and then that kind of reinforces this idea, and everybody else like, oh, people of color just aren't reliable board members, right? And so it's like this this way of just missing and understanding how this kind of behavior is really toxic, and it just drives people out. And so look at your history's formation, look at the patterns of recruitment, look at the bylaws, looking at the requirements to serve on the board, look at the cost in dollars and the cost in time, and figuring out what is it that we're doing that's keeping people of color from being on the board, right? And what's the culture of the board? How have we engaged in tokenism? What's the location? Where are we holding our board meetings? Are we on a public transportation route? What time, what day are we meeting, right? And how are the societal inequities playing into who's able to participate given all of our rules. And so what can we do to make it shift? And partly what you can do is interview past board members of diverse social identities to try to understand why they left and what was their experience and where did things go awry. And then as Jeff mentioned, you know, the training piece is so important. So having anti-racism training, gender inclusive training, training that addresses class awareness, that goes through the history of races in the United States and the material impact of bias and inequities. And then skills for talking about bias. How do we call in? We know that call out culture doesn't really help boards or organizations to thrive. We need to be able to have respectful and impactful conversations with one another so that we can actually impact change. And so how do we address microaggressions? How do we interrupt bias? And then how do we start to operationalize policies and practices? Because it's not just about being nice and it's not just about being inclusive, but it's about having policies that will really make a difference in operationalizing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm giving a shout out and a big thanks for John for sharing with us the JEDI acronym. We hadn't heard of it before, but it is so important to add the justice piece to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So thank you for sharing that with us. And having a JEDI strategic plan and making sure that people of diverse identities and especially racially and ethnically diverse groups, sometimes people sort of lump together people of color or lump together BIPOC, but it's really important to think about the unique and individual cultures and ethnic groups that we want to include, the different voices and perspectives that we want to bring. What people who are Latinx experience is different than what people who are Asian American experience is different, what people with dark skin are experiencing across the country, right? And so we really want to think about how, you know, are we including or thinking about the experience of Native Americans and Pacific Islanders and the LGBTQ community and people with disabilities? And so coming up with a clear mission statement and strategic goals. And then for recruitment, form a recruitment committee and make sure that you've got diverse social identities on it. Really consider the benefits of doing individual interviews versus group focus groups, because by having a group of people of color. We did this actually with COSA, the Council of Service Agencies of Hampshire County. We pulled together a focus group of people of different racial and ethnic identities together to have conversations about what were the needs, what were the priorities, where were the gaps, more likely to get a group of people to want to join together because they're part of a cohort. Nobody wants to feel like a token person of color coming into a mostly white organization or a mostly white board. And so then, you know, provide some mentoring, provide some onboarding, right? And then use surveys to keep checking in with folks to get their experiences and to find out what's working for them and what's not. And thinking about ways of having democratic participation, like rotating facilitation and having an open Google Doc for, you know, creating the agenda together. And so that way that you're really inviting your new members to bring their energy and their ideas and not have to just assimilate into what always happened before. And then, you know, you can have an informational handout about why is it great to be on a board? What do people get from being on a board? How are they going to benefit, right? The networking opportunities and the professional development experiences and how this will look good on a CV or on a resume, right? And so try to really think about what people will benefit, how people will benefit from being on your board. And then start identifying the community stakeholders, leaders, business owners, not-for-profit workers, organizations of diverse social identities, and schedule those one-on-one and group meetings. Have those conversations. Don't just send a letter, but make an interpersonal connection. And think about your interview questions and embed diversity, equity, inclusion questions. What's your track record? What connections do you have to communities of color? What experience do you have in creating gender inclusive spaces, right? And so that you're not just looking for people to do the same old, but people who really have skills in diversity, equity, inclusion. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to all of you. We'd love to hear from all of you. So you can raise your hand using your toggle, your Zoom feature, or you can just literally raise your hand if you have a question, and I'll invite people one at a time to unmute and share with us, or you can give us some feedback. Let's start with Cynthia.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, loud and clear.
So I want to tell you, after 14 months of being in Zoom webinars, et cetera, this is like one of the best. So congratulations to all of you. It was really well thought out and put together. My specific question is, and I might be overlapping here, you've talked about, John and Deborah, you've talked about training, grants, free. So what are those? How do we get them? I'm on 3 boards, and so we're all interested in this topic. So how do we access those things?
Okay, so if you look in your folder that Kate posted in the chat box, there's also the flyer for the Chamber of Commerce trainings, Interrupting Racism Level 1 and 2, and it looks like it just reappeared again. You can also sign up. Let's see. Is it, I'm trying to see, is that on the Chamber's website? Yeah. Vince is giving me a nod. So also on the Chamber's website, you should be able to find these trainings and sign up. We do have to limit the number of people who can be in each training. So we encourage you to quickly go on in and sign up. We're asking folks to limit it to up to 6 people per agency, and that way as many organizations as possible can attend. And thank you. Thank you for your feedback and questions, Cynthia. And let's go with Marjorie.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, everyone. This was so useful. My name is Marjorie Hess, and I'm a trustee at Forbes Library. And we are different, I think, from all of you in that we are an elected board. So we can't go through all of these steps have been so helpful, but they're really for appointed boards. The most we can do as trustees is encourage people to run for the trustee position. We have an election coming up this November. We do have an open seat. And we can post the information that there is an election and people are encouraged to run. I love any suggestions of what more we can do to diversify the board. We're a 5-member board, all white. It would be, we should diversify.
Thank you. That's a great question. So that's really interesting that you have a different structure for getting on boards. Kevin, do you have any thoughts that you'd like to share?
Well, the thing about elected board, and here's the challenge. I mean, my first thought is, where are you posting the information? You're a member of the chamber. You posting it on the chamber website. Talk with Vince. Can it go out in the chamber newsletter? And I would think that you would want, since your library is in the community, that you would be looking for the people that are sitting right here or are part of this programming should be a part of that process of helping you procure candidates. I do the same thing. I'm the National Association of Social Workers, NASW Mass Chapter. I'm on their nominating committee for an elected, for elected board members, right? And so what we start is we have a nominating committee that seeks out diverse candidates and says, hey, there's going to be an election. This is when the elections happen. And we talk to them about what it means to serve. And then we get them involved and we explain to them and say, we'd love to see you run. Can we put your name in the hat? And I think having the types of conversations that you just heard about here, those one-on-ones, those meetings, and saying it's elected, take a shot. We're not in tokenism. We're looking for your talent and your perspective, because especially with a library, what is a library without a diverse population or a diverse collection of literature and information, right? Sounds fantastic. Really good to hear, Marjorie. Thank you for asking the question.
Well, thank you. That is very helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Other questions, comments, thoughts? And I see Jess, you've got a hand up.
I just wanted to share with Marjorie that the Chamber has a newsletter. It currently goes out to about, 5,100 people plus, and it is growing. And that is just the kind of information that we would be happy to share. So you can reach out to me, or I can be in touch with Lisa and just let you know how to post that information to our community connector. And we'd be happy to do so.
Thank you. That is perfect.
Any other questions?
I had another thought also, just about making sure that it's very clear to the public that you are committed to this. So even mentioning that you're doing this Zoom today, and mentioning that you're doing any, as a board, that you're doing some anti-racism trainings, I think will make it clear to the community that you are looking for some more diverse members who will also really be taken seriously. I think it's really important to demonstrate that. And then from our process, ask particularly. Tell people that you're looking for particular characteristics in your next board members.
Thanks, Jen. I could also add a thought, which is taking advantage of the colleges. You know, you think about the lens and the experience and expertise that college faculty bring, and that there are, you know, college faculty of color in our local 5-college community, and even a little bit beyond if you start looking into the community colleges. And so that might be a great resource as well.
Very good. Thank you.
And Sarah, would you like to ask a question? You're muted, Sarah.
I'm from Historic Northampton and Northampton Neighbors. I thought this was really wonderful, and I'd like to share this with other board members, and I'm wondering how we can, or how I could get hold of the 2 slideshows that were shown.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll just hop in because it's an easy answer. We will post this information on our website. And if you are signed up for our newsletter, in an upcoming newsletter, we'll say, here's the information. And we can also send it out to everyone who has attended. So more to come on that, and we will certainly make it available.
Good.
And there should be a PDF of our slides in that folder that Kate shared. And if for some reason you're not able to open it, we'll make sure that we give it to Jess, and so she could put it on the Chamber's website. So we're running out of time. So I just want to thank everybody and pass it back to Vince for some last few words.
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for moderating this enlightening and insightful session today. And thanks to all of our panelists, Kevin, Jeff, John, and Jen, for sharing your experiences and your wisdom around D&I. This work is so important, and we have a great start. We've got experts who are, you know, living and breathing as subject matter experts to rely on, and we've got each other. So let's leverage each other and the resources that we bring to continue this work and maintain the momentum. So again, thank you, and stay tuned for the GNCC show, which will air on the small screen near you on June 9th. It's our annual meeting, and the second time that we'll be coming to you virtually, and you don't want to miss it. So thank you again, and with that, have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Great job, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks so much, everybody.